Hello and welcome to the video that's titled Glenrowan to ... And the reason that it's ... is because there's no particular place I'm going from here, or there's no marker to say I've reached a certain destination. I just happen to be at the Glenrowan Service Centre, which is on the Hume Highway in Victoria. It's about 260 kilometres north of Melbourne, and about, I think, something like 80 kilometres or so from the New South Wales border. And I happened to be there and decided to make sure the camera was working before I set off on the next part of the trip. And so we've got about 15 minutes worth of footage here for me to talk to you about things, and we'll just be getting up the Hume Highway towards Albury, which is the first town or city, I guess, on the New South Wales side of the Murray River. Now I'm going to start off by telling you a story about Glenrowan, Mick Jagger and the song Wild Horses by the Rolling Stones. You'll probably wonder how those three things are connected, but I'll get to that in this story. So Glenrowan is a village, I guess is probably the best word to describe it, with a population of about 1,000 people within the area of the greater city of Wangaratta. And I think it's probably mainly a service centre for the agricultural industries that are around Glenrowan, which I imagine are sheep and beef cattle and things like that. But it's most famous for things that happened in the 19th century. In the 19th century, Australia's most famous bush ranger, and for those who live outside Australia, bush rangers are what the Americans call outlaws and what the English call highwaymen. But Australia's most famous bushranger, Ned Kelly, was captured at the Glenrowan Hotel after having laid siege to the hotel. After a shootout with the police, he was captured, eventually transported by rail, I believe, back to Melbourne, where he faced trial for his various crimes and eventually was hanged. He had been involved in a number of scrapes with the police over the years, and in the description of this video when it goes on YouTube, I'll put a link to a book about bushrangers where you can find out more about Ned Kelly. It's a children's book, so it's not very long. It takes about 15 minutes to watch that video. But what happened was that after various altercations with the police, Ned Kelly and his mates took over the Glenrowan Hotel and held the patrons there hostage. The police came and there was a shootout. Ned Kelly had fashioned a suit of armour made out of bits of old iron and a helmet that had a slit cut out so he could see what he was doing, but protected his head. The other members of the gang were all disposed of fairly quickly, but the police firing bullets at Ned Kelly, and they all sort of bounced off him, and eventually he was shot by somebody shooting him in the back of the leg. You might recall from one of the Clint Eastwood movies, I think it was The Fistful of Dollars or the other dollar movie, where he had a similar scene where he had a door from a wood stove that he used as a chest plate to protect him from bullets, and that was also recreated by Marty McFly in the last of the Back to the Future movies. Now, what's all this got to do with Mick Jagger, you might wonder? Well, Ned Kelly's been the subject of several movies. The first of those was made in the late 19th or early 20th century by an Australian director, when Australians made movies about Australian characters before Hollywood discovered Australian locations. There was a film called The History of the Kelly Gang. Later on, in about the late 60s or early 70s, a British production company decided to make another film about Ned Kelly, and they cast Mick Jagger in the role of Ned Kelly. Yes, that famous Mick Jagger that's still around from the Rolling Stones, they cast him in the role of Ned Kelly. So he came out to Australia and he brought his girlfriend at the time, who was Marianne Faithfull. He was down in Victoria at a place called Beechworth, which is near Glenrowan, filming scenes for the movie, when Marianne Faithfull, who was up in Sydney, somehow got it into her head that Mick was about to dump her for someone else. So she took an overdose of something or other, and production on the film had to be halted, or shooting on the film had to be halted, and Mick had to dash to Sydney and reassure Marianne that wasn't the case. And it's alleged that he uttered the words, "Wild horses couldn't drag him away." And I'm not sure whether the words came before the song or the words came from the song, but many musical historians would dispute that the song belongs to the Stones, even though Jagger and Richards are credited with writing it. they dispute that because Graham Parsons, who was a member of a band or a group called the Flying Burrito Brothers, which was the leftovers of the Byrds after David Crosby had been fired and Roger McGuinn had gone off and done his own thing, had been working on this song Wild Horses, and apparently had played it to Keith, who he was friends with and hung out with at the time, and Keith liked it, and according to the music historians, allegedly purloined it, finished it, and Mick and Keith put it on the next album they were producing. Now, whether all that happened or not, whether that's the right sequence or not, I don't know, but certainly the song Wild Horses contains that line in the chorus, "Wild horses couldn't drag me away," and it's alleged that Mick said that to Marion. So that's the story of how Glenrowan, Mick Jagger and the Stones song are all connected. You might wonder why it was I was at Glenrowan in the first place. Well, if you saw the last clip, I left Bacchus Marsh and I was on my way back to Goulburn, and by the time I got to Glenrowan I had travelled about 220 kilometres. Now, one of the things that I commented on about the Spider not long after I got it is that the fuel gauge is terribly inaccurate. It's almost a waste of time. And I say that because after about 220 kilometres the needle points to empty, and then about the same time the fuel light starts to flash, which generally indicates that you haven't got much petrol left. There's no provision on the information screen anywhere to give you a distance to empty or range or anything like that, so when the fuel light starts to flash you naturally get concerned that you might run out of fuel. On the Kawasaki Voyager that I owned, when the fuel light started to flash, there was a distance to empty option, but you knew you had about 50 or 60 kilometres depending on your speed to go before you actually had no fuel left. So generally you could find a servo. In this case, you don't have that option. So fuel gauge is showing empty, fuel light starting to flash, 220 kilometres, and so I come across the Glenrowan Service Centre, which is on the highway, and I pull in to get petrol. Now, one of the things that is good about the Spider is that when you set the trip meter, when you go to look at it, not only does it tell you how many kilometres you've travelled in that trip, it tells you how long, in terms of hours or minutes, you've been riding. And it turns out that 220 kilometres equates with about 2 hours and 20 minutes of riding for me, bearing in mind that I'd come through some built-up areas on the way between Bacchus Marsh and the highway, so I couldn't always travel at 100. So when I get to Glenrowan and the fuel light's flashing and the fuel gauge is showing empty, it's well and truly time to fill up or stop and fill up. So I fill the bike up, and it turns out it takes about 16 and a half, maybe 17 litres. So the tank's a 25 litre tank. So in practice, you've got about 8 litres left, and I probably would have got another 80 kilometres or so, maybe more. Maybe I would have even got to Albury out of what was left in the fuel tank. But one of those bits of folklore about bikes is that you should never buy a bike you can't push. Now, these things are 450 kilos, and I don't fancy pushing them in very far, and even if I did have to push it, it's a long way to the next petrol station. So I fill up at Glenrowan, and that takes me on to the next stop, which turned out to be Holbrook, that you won't see in this video, but that's where the next stop was. So I'm told by some people, I've read somewhere, that if you disconnect the analogue gauge, that the readout you get on the information screen, which is a digital readout, will give you a much more accurate indication of how much petrol's in the tank. But other people who've done that say, no, it doesn't really make any difference, it's just poor instrumentation. So to me, that is one of the drawbacks of the Spider, not one that I'd say to people, well, don't buy one because of it. And I don't know whether later models now have a distance to empty or range, or whether they've improved the instrumentation or the gauge reading, but as I say, it's a pretty inaccurate reading. The other thing that I've found about the Spider, and I also commented on this when I first got it, is that for the rider on the RT models, at least the one I've got, and I'm not sure if it's changed, I suspect it has, but maybe, I don't know, is that the rider has foot pegs rather than footboards. Now, you might think, well, what difference does that make? But if you're a rider and you're riding a long distance, you'll know what difference it makes, but I'll explain it. Generally, you put your foot on the peg so that it's towards the back of the arch of your foot. Well, you certainly have to do that on the Spider because of the positioning of the the foot brake, which is the only brake pedal, by the way, on or the only brake mechanism on the Spider, is one pedal that operates all three brakes. So you've got the back of the arch of your foot on this peg, which means that the weight of the rest of the weight of your foot is sort of hanging down below the as an extra weight on your it's sort of just hanging down off the peg, and so that after a while it's not supported. But also because of the positioning of the pegs, your knees, well, certainly in my case, and I'm a man that's nearly 70 years old, you tend to get a bit of discomfort in your knees after about 180, 190 kilometres. And then you're thinking, well, if I move my foot further back, my foot will be supported more. And yes, that happens, but then the strain on the knees is even greater because the angle becomes acute rather than a right angle. And if you move your feet forward, there's nowhere to put them. There are two black plastic heat deflectors on the RT that obviously deflect the heat coming from the radiator away from the rider's feet, and you can put your feet on there, but they're plastic, and I wouldn't suggest you put a lot of weight on them or hold them there for a long time. So at about the 220 kilometre mark, you're getting to the stage where your knees are getting a bit stiff and the thighs are getting a bit uncomfortable, and it's well and truly time to get off the bike anyway, fill up with fuel. If you're a coffee drinker, get yourself a coffee, use the facilities if you need to, stretch your legs, walk around for a few minutes, whatever it is you need to do before jumping back on the bike and going again. Now, I know there are some footboard options. One option that you can get is that footboards that bolt directly over those pegs, and there's another set you can get that bolt over those, somehow attached to the bike just around those heat deflectors, but they're about $500 a pop, so they're not cheap. The ones that bolt directly on the pegs are only fairly short, as they have to be, because you have to be able to reach the brake pedal on the right hand side. There are bigger ones that are sort of have three different foot positions that end up almost looking like highway pegs on a cruiser, but again they're more expensive as well. So I feel that was one of the drawbacks of the cruiser, of the Spider, but not a sufficient drawback to say don't buy one, but a consideration. And perhaps the peg should be moved a little bit further forward to allow your legs to be a little bit further in front of you. So those are things to consider about the Spider. Now, if you were going to buy a Spider, you wouldn't buy one if you were just going to use it for your daily commute, bearing in mind that most people in Australia spend about 33 kilometres each day in their car, and that's often just going down to the park and ride where they get the train and so on, because it's a bike that's made for the open road. If you were looking for a three-wheel type machine like the Spider for doing the daily commute that could also do some touring, you might consider the Riker, which is a cut-down version of the Spider. It doesn't have all the bells and whistles and doesn't have the impressive size of the Spider, but it has the two wheels at the front, is belt driven. Instead of a semi-automatic, it has a CVT gearbox, and has a full reverse and a parking brake and so on. They come in 600, which is Lambs, and 900 and 900 Sports. I'm not sure what the difference between the two 900 versions is, but they were Can-Am's attempt at attracting the commuter market, but also provided some potential for doing a bit of touring. The reason I'd say you wouldn't buy the Spider for your daily commute is it's a big bike, it's thirsty. It would be certainly thirsty if you were doing it daily commute in it, and it's, as I've said many a time, almost as big as a small hatch, so it's not the sort of thing you can zip in and out of the lanes and lane split with. You probably couldn't do that with the Riker either, but it's a much more agile bike because it's smaller. All right, well, thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the ride up the Hume Highway here. This is the dual carriageway going north to Albury, and if you stop at any point you can see those cheege cutter barriers on either side that I referred to, and there's a very large strip between the two lanes, which makes it pretty safe and a good ride. Thank you for watching. I hope you've enjoyed this video and found something informative about it, and I hope I can talk to you again when I'm making the next video.